Hello there. So this is, I thought, would be a useful video for those doing coursework, particularly those doing Tudor coursework. Now, what we look at are interpretations, so different views in history, which essentially is what history is about. It's often quite easy to find out the actual events, what happens, though not always. So we know there were religious changes in the 1530s. We know that Henry became supreme head. What's debated, and this is history essentially, is why that happened. You know, how it happened, who was who was most responsible, I should say, for making it happen. And there's two particular views about this that Glyn Redworth sets up. One is the revisionist view, which I've put here, which is the view that the English remained Catholic. So the Reformation, the religious changes were imposed from the top. And against this is the traditional view. The Reformation, so the religious changes, proves the Catholic Church was unpopular and hated. This is what monarchs in the past used to say. This is what traditional historians in centuries past used to say. England went its own way. It's much better than Spain, France, Italy, etc. Got rid of the Pope and ultimately became, a much better democracy without foreign interference. You can see sort of the modern links, can't you, and the sort of hatred of Europe. However, he raises the problem here. A lot of revisionist historians say that there was faction at Henry VIII's court. So basically, there were different groups competing for power. Cromwell and the Reformers are one example there. And he says that presuming that many people, historians, presume that factional conflict is inimical to following a coherent policy. Inimical means basically being hostile, so being against. He says if you have faction, then therefore there's no consistent policy. And what revisionists say is yes, there was faction, but there was consistent policy. So they get a little bit confused. That's kind of one of the debates. Coherent means consistent. Was Henry VIII completely in control? And that is the purpose of this article. Was Henry VIII completely in control? And as I said before, a good way to do this is to actually look at both the start of the article, which is tricky in this case, and the end of the article. I'm actually going to be a bit naughty and jump to the end of the article, because quite clearly he's saying the revisionist view was the case, that the English Reformation religious changes happened because they were imposed from the top. And this is how he backs it up towards the end. He says here, and I've highlighted some of the key parts which you can use for your coursework. He says that Cromwell, so the chief minister, and you can compare this to the article by dear maid McCulloch, which I've got. I've also put up on the VLE. Much like him, he says that Cromwell was more than willing to work towards an understanding with radical German princes, so basically Protestants in what is now Germany. And he says they were hostile to the papacy, so they were hostile to the Pope. He's got lots of Lutheran, so Protestant contacts, and that means if England was invaded and threatened in the 1530s, because remember that Henry VIII has been excommunicated, then Henry VIII is going to have allies, he's going to have mates on his side from Germany, so Protestants helping him. Because it says here, an anti-Roman front, so people against the Pope. So from the threat of invasion, because of his excommunication, Henry's going to have people on his side. However, the people who were going to actually invade him were the French and the Holy Roman Empire, I'll put HRE, and they suddenly fell apart. They were no longer allies, so Henry was much less afraid. So because the French Imperial, the Holy Roman Empire alliance had fallen apart, it says here that Cromwell had outlived his usefulness. And this is on the last page of the coursework, and feel free to have a look and zoom in on this, that's fine. So Henry was more concerned about preserving his royal status as well as determined to preserve essential Catholic doctrine. It's saying here that Henry VIII is a Catholic. That's what it's saying. And therefore, Redworth says, Henry seems to have consciously made up his mind to permit Cromwell's enemies, a classic example, if in doubt, as I said before, say Norfolk, to destroy the one and only vicegerent in spirituals, that's his flash title, because Cromwell's second in command in the church, on charges of treason. Now he says those charges are ridiculous, but the key point is he says that Henry, this is Redworth, the writer, allowed Cromwell's enemies to get rid of him. And he says there was also good reasons for destroying Anne Boleyn in 1536, because Henry wanted to get married and he wanted to get rid of a very unpopular queen. So the key point here is he says that far from Henry being a vacillating monarch, and vacillating means very much kind of back and forth, you know, sometimes he's Catholic, sometimes he's Protestant. He says he'd adopted a level-headed, so he's thought it through, thoroughly ruthless attitude to what he rightly or wrongly saw as the best interests of his church. And then Redworth finishes by saying the king was certainly no saint, but the policies he pursued were not entirely inconsistent, so they were coherent. Coming back to earlier, it did make sense with his role as supreme head of the church. And in lots of ways, Henry, how he's written about in this article, comes across as very similar to Wooding. Wooding calls Henry an Anglican, so an English church Catholic. And again, Redworth says that Henry believed in Catholic doctrine. He was only using different people like Cromwell, Norfolk and others to keep himself as supreme head. So those who are arguing a little bit about power can use this to back them up. You can compare this to Wooding, the article by Lucy Wooding that's very similar. You can also compare it to the article on heretics, which also references this article as well, the Greg Walker article, which is all about Henry VIII being the most important person for the Reformation. But essentially, it's saying that Henry's not weak, he remains Catholic, he's pushing through these changes and using people like Anne Boleyn, Cromwell to get what he wanted. He's not a weak, easily seduced, easily manipulated, whatever monarch. He's the one driving this policy. Somebody that goes against that, though, you can mention, as a final point, is someone called Derek Wilson. His article's also on there, and he calls Henry, I think it's a lovely phrase actually, a reluctant referee. He says that, you know, first Henry listens to Anne Boleyn, then he listens to Cromwell, then he listens to the Catholics. He gets annoyed because he's executed Cromwell, he gets annoyed because he's executed Anne Boleyn, and he's completely kind of back and forth. So he disagrees. Wooding and Walker essentially agree with what Redworth is saying, which is why it's quite a key article. And if you watch the Tudors, and it is good fun watching the Tudors, as well as sort of perving a little bit on Jonathan Rhys-Meyers, or whatever his name is, he is at least completely in control. He's always playing people off against each other in the Tudors. He might be a little bit crazy, but he's the one in control. And that's what this article is actually saying. Henry's driving policy. He wants to say supreme head. He likes the power. So his policy is coherent, and that is why the religious changes happened. Henry wants to stay Catholic but stay supreme head, and any influence from others is just because Henry's using them to get what he wants. So it is more than a divorce. It's Henry pushing these changes to get more power for himself. I hope that's helpful. Take care. Thanks everyone. Bye.